Hey everyone, so the SimplePlanes 2 demo was out for a few days, and during that time I got the opportunity to test it out. And today I just kind of want to talk over the demo, kind of what my first impressions are, and give you all an idea on how it performs, how it feels, how it looks, basically everything about this game that I can think of to talk about. Let's get started. So the first thing that's kind of probably the most important thing is performance of the aircraft and vehicles in this game. I felt like in general, planes flew, they worked, it felt good. The planes felt more realistic, a little nicer to fly, a little smoother than in the original Simple Planes. The cars felt phenomenal. The Aeon, I think it's pronounced, is really smooth. It feels amazing to drift it. It was pretty awesome. I don't really have any complaints about how it performed in terms of, how planes fly and everything. It is different, however, when you start importing your old creations from SimplePlanes 1. So with aircraft, usually it seems like they just kind of keep the old physics and don't really use the new physics modeling system. So if you import a plane, it'll fly the same way, which is great. And it works okay for planes. However, for some reason, cars, that doesn't seem to work correctly. And so most of the cars I tried, even the really high effort ones, tended to be kind of undrivable, which was really unfortunate. And I'm not really sure if that was just because of comparison, because I'd just driven these amazing feeling cars, they felt so good. I don't know what the deal was, but cars just from SimplePlanes 1 don't really carry over super well, which is a huge shame. The stock aircraft are really cool. All of them are, I believe, around the 300 to 350 parts range, and they all look amazing. There's a ton of stock craft. I didn't bother to review all of them. I did fly most of them, but there's some helicopters, there's some jets, there's some cars, there's plenty of interesting stuff going on. And I think the vehicles in this game, the small sample that we had was phenomenal. I would highly recommend driving any of these, really. So far everything has been pretty good. Flight performance feels good. Aircraft, like the stock aircraft, feel pretty good. The one thing I have not been super impressed about is the map. We really only have a small slice of what's available, but this slice that we do have feels kind of underdone. It's like the roads, for instance, driving around on the roads feels pretty nice. They're interesting, they're dynamic, they're curvy, but there's no way, you start a car on the default runway location, there's no way to get on a road. There's a tiny little gap you can maybe squeeze through, but if you're in a bigger vehicle, there's no chance. And that's just such a baffling design decision. There's a racetrack, you can get on the racetrack, and there's no real good way to get from the racetrack to the road or from the road to the runway. The racetrack and the runway are completely separated from the road with barriers that you can't really get over or around in a car, except for a couple spots if you're in kind of a skinnier vehicle. And that is just infuriating for some reason. I don't know what it is. That seems like very poor design. I don't know what they were thinking with this one. Overall, the map isn't too bad. The racetrack I actually really like. The sort of drift area is pretty nice. You can see off in the distance where they're planning to add other stuff. That seems interesting. In terms of visuals, the map doesn't really look all that impressive. You see over by this little lighthouse area, a lot of the houses, it seems to just be they copied and pasted them, which seems a little lazy, but they probably did most of this just to keep the file size down. So, I can't really fault them too much. This slice of the map that we have is pretty boring, pretty uninteresting. There's a few things to do. There's the racetrack, which is honestly pretty cool. There's a couple runways, which are kind of and there is the road area, the road section, which is pretty nice. And I like the trees and all the little details around here. So overall, I give the roads about a 8 out of 10. I give the airport about a 6 out of 10. No, I'll raise that up. I'll give it another 8 out of 10. The airport's pretty nice, but just the map design for this little chunk of the game, I really hope it's not representative of what the finished product will look like, because it's pretty eh. And another thing that's pretty eh is the graphics. I understand this is probably going to be a mobile game at some point, and so they have to cut some corners, make some sacrifices, and it's not going to look as good. But I just feel like stylistically, it's just really, really awful. These like asphalt textures, the grass textures, they all look really bad, and I don't really know why. Something about the style of this little dude, Chad, something about that just really rubs me the wrong way. I know taste is pretty subjective. I'm just really not a huge fan of this. The original SimplePlanes, I'll admit, was not exactly the best looking piece of work of all time, but that's a 10-year-old mobile game like that got turned into a PC game. I'll give it some slack. But it really feels like they just found some default textures, they slapped it on some meshes, and they were focusing more on building everything out than actually making it look nice. So again, in terms of how the game looks, most of the time it's not great. But there are a couple of exceptions. The biggest thing is the water. The water looks phenomenal. I give the water a 10 out of 10. Some of the best I've seen in video games, period. Like, it's amazing. So they did an amazing job on the water. Driving, I didn't really drive too many boats around. There aren't really any boats I could see that were made that would be good for this. So I didn't really mess with boats too much. But the one like amphibious vehicle I did kind of performed horribly in SimplePlanes 1, but in this demo, it did amazing. And I don't know what it was that changed. I don't know if it's the physics. I don't know what the deal was, but it felt really good going through the water. And the water looks amazing as well. The other thing that looks pretty good is like the jet engines. All this exhaust coming out the back, the way it deforms, all the lighting, it looks phenomenal. They did a really good job on this. The clouds, they look pretty solid. They're volumetric. They're not the most impressive thing I've ever seen, but I gotta give them credit. These look pretty nice and they feel pretty nice. It's dynamic. I like these a lot. So there's a few things graphically that they did a good job on, but it feels almost like most of their work in terms of graphics went into, writing the code for things, writing the code to make the waves go up and down. I'm not a game developer, but it seemed like most of the graphics that are done well are sort of the shaders and the things that apply globally. All of that looks pretty good, but then it kind of falls apart when you see the textures and the design of the world. So I'm not a huge fan of the graphics overall. I think it could use some improvement. Stylistically, it's not really my thing. I don't think it's a deal breaker. I think the rest of the game does speak for itself, and I think it holds up. I think it's still pretty good. So, long story short, graphics, not the best, but it's not the worst. But what is pretty bad is the performance of this game in general. I have had the opportunity to test it on 3 different systems. My decently nice gaming computer with a Ryzen 7600 and an AMD GPU, an RX 7800 XT. So reasonably high-end hardware, not thousands of dollars, but probably in the higher percentile of what people are going to be using on this game. The other 2 things I tested it on are a Valve Steam Deck and my laptop, which is a really normal laptop, not meant for video games, nothing like that. So, in general, in multiplayer, with the stock aircraft, it performed pretty well. I have footage up on the screen from the Steam Deck. You can see, it looked fine. Nothing wrong with it. On the gaming computer, same deal. Higher resolution, obviously, but the frame rate was good. It all looked pretty smooth. Honestly, no gripes in terms of performance in single player with those stock aircraft. However, once you get into multiplayer, performance is pretty bad. I understand it's not really easy to simulate, thousands of all these little parts and the physics calculations, and there's all this reason for this lag. And I'm not really sure what can be done in terms of optimization. Maybe that's improving multi-core processing. I don't know. I'm not the smartest but I have a theory that there's not a ton they can do to make it run a little smoother. On my laptop, I did have to set the settings to low, and I still got that 60 FPS, perfectly smooth single-player experience with the stock aircraft. But when I joined multiplayer, it was pretty much unplayable. And my suspicion is, graphically, there's not a ton happening. I've played harder things on this computer. It's not really what I use it for, but I have tested it out to play some games, and it works pretty well most of the time. But I think what's happening is we were getting more CPU load than it was really meant for, and it kind of struggled. And on my gaming desktop that was kind of built for this, not for this specifically, but for gaming specifically, it did much better. It had the ability to kind of offload the graphics processing, cool down a little bit maybe, and so it could focus more of its processing power on, running the game. And so when I went into multiplayer, it would still drop dramatically. It went down from 180 to 200 on good times to like 70 to 80 with occasional drops below 60. On the Steam Deck, I kept it on the low settings for multiplayer, and it stayed. The general thing I'll say is it stayed above 20, and most of the time it was above 30 in multiplayer, but it dropped to around 20, maybe below 20 a couple times. It was pretty bad. And I will say, I'm not giving you, the part count numbers and the number of people on the server. And, I'll give you a general estimation. It was probably about 6 to 8 at any given time, most of them using stock aircraft from the game. So, not the craziest loads that were going on, but my point is, essentially, it's very difficult for your computer to handle multiplayer. If you were used to playing, the original SimplePlanes on some potato, you might want to just stick to that game. Multiplayer on the original SimplePlanes could slow things down a little bit, but I don't remember it being as drastic as this. And that leads me to some speculation that multiplayer might not be on mobile when the mobile version launches. Obviously we only have the demo, and performance could improve drastically before launch, but performance was kind of abysmal. And I think, if I was struggling to run it on something built for gaming, like the Steam Deck, or something that, wasn't exactly the most powerful, but it was certainly reasonable, and probably a little more powerful than your average phone, if I was struggling to run it on those things, I suspect that the average phone user is going to struggle. Like maybe if you have the flagship, the brand new iPhone, the brand new Samsung, whatever, it'll probably do okay. But my suspicion is when the full game launches on mobile, there's going to be, if there is multiplayer, it's going to be very rough. It's going to be a brutal experience. And it wouldn't surprise me if for this reason they didn't launch with multiplayer at all. Now, there are features to limit how many people you can have on the server and how many parts their crafts can be. But, I was in a 10 player. It was maybe more than 10. It was probably like 12 or 13 players. And they had to drop the part limit below what the stock crafts were. It was around 250 in order to even make it playable. And that was kind of rough, kind of hard to see. I was playing on the Steam Deck at the time, so it was performance that's not the most powerful device of all time. But I will say, if you're expecting the game to work on the same potato you used to play the original on, you might be in for a disappointment, which is really sad. But the original SimplePlanes is almost 10 years old at this point, so it's not too hard to believe that they needed to kind of sacrifice on performance a little bit to bring it up to date. Now, the last thing I have to talk about is just how the game can be broken or abused. And the first thing I wanted to do was try and break out of this sort of predefined little slice of the map that they gave us at the start. Obviously, there is sort of this little area you're not supposed to leave, and if you do try and leave, there'll be missiles that shoot at you. And what they don't say is it'll also straight reverse your momentum so that you're suddenly going in the opposite direction. Now, I had messed around trying to get past the missiles. I actually did manage to get past the missiles and not get shot by them, but then my direction was completely reversed and I found my plane going the opposite way that it came from. And so, long story short, I could not figure out a way to get out, even with my experience, no clipping and trying to get around this type of thing in the original. And by the way, no clipping does still work. I don't know why, but it does. The one major exploit, and this isn't really an exploit, I'd say this is sort of an abuse of an intended feature. So the aircraft files are stored as XML. That's a pretty standard format used for text specifically, just something that they can easily read and you can make changes to. And so I started messing around with it. I was like, it'd be fun if I moved this wheel up a little bit. Or, I'd try to slam the Aeon, however you pronounce it, turn it into some kind of drift car, turn up the horsepower a little bit, see kind of what was going on with the transmission, the gearing, all of this. It was kind of interesting. But it took a really long time because you had to sort of dig through this XML file and then make changes to it and then save it and then reload the thing in the game. And I was like, you know what, I might as well speed this up. And so I turned that, with a lot of help from ChatGPT and a little bit of Python knowledge, I turned that into a fully functioning app that I could open up. I could load an aircraft file, it could show all of its attributes and it could show every part and everything you could change on that part. And I messed around with that so much. I moved stuff around, I broke stuff, I made things more powerful. It was amazing. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to post this on the website, specifically on the forums. And that wasn't the best idea. So, long story short, that probably wasn't smart of me to make that. And I wouldn't wouldn't really call it an exploit, but that's the only real way I found that could sort of quote-unquote break the game. And so honestly, it's a bit more robust than the original SimplePlanes, if you will. So, overall, if I had to give the game a rating, I'd give it a solid 7 out of 10. It's kind of mediocre, I'll be completely honest. I'm not a huge fan of this demo. And the reason why is it just feels underdone. It feels half-baked. I'm just not a huge fan of it. The art style just doesn't sit well with me. The music, the music is alright. Taste is subjective. I understand they're not going to go hiring all these, Grammy-winning artists or anything. I don't really have anything against the music. Some of the tracks were good. Some of them I didn't really like, and I had to mute the game because they were kind of annoying. But overall, the style just doesn't really sit with me. I'm not a huge fan of it. And, I can get around that if the gameplay is really something else, really special. And for me, driving the default vehicles around was reasonably fun, but the map just didn't have anything to do. It wasn't very engaging, and it wasn't very fun. Importing my old crafts from SimplePlanes 1 was really fun, but again, it's the same vehicles. I might as well have just downloaded a mod map and then used Reshade or something, and I'd be getting roughly the same experience. And so overall, I didn't really feel like the demo changed my opinion on the original. I think that the demo is alright, but at the end of the day, they didn't really change anything that significant. Planes fly a little smoother, things look a little nicer, and apart from that, it's really hard for me to give this an overwhelmingly positive review. And so, if I can kind of leave you with that idea for a second, just remember, this is a demo. And what we don't have access to is the building features. That could be a game changer. Look at these stock aircraft. They were all presumably made in the designer for this game. And they are made with a few hundred parts. And they are about the same craft that would take up thousands of parts, if not tens of thousands in some cases in the original game. And so maybe when the builder opens up, maybe that's the game changer, the thing that will make this game worth it. But until then, I'm not really convinced. So that's all I have to say. I just want to leave you with that. If you like the video, I appreciate it. This is the longest video I've ever made, so hopefully it was good. And if you have any questions, any feedback, please, please, please leave a comment. I will answer anything I come across. All right, peace.